very nice talk and very, very interesting and important questions. I'm not sure exactly that I understand some of the constructs here, because I'm not sure that I fully understand a competence, a transgression against competence. If I'm, if I'm a tree trimming service person and I'm trying to cut down a tree and I don't do it sufficiently competently, is that a transgression?
To the extent that, so I'm using the word transgression a bit loosely, a more appropriate term may be a violation of trust, in the sense that to the extent that you had trusted that person to perform that task well initially and they screw up, you will be less willing to make yourself vulnerable to that person doing that again for another tree as a result of that. So if you define trust as a willingness to make yourself vulnerable in situations involving risk, and you see that that willingness is lowered as a result of these incidents, that's essentially the domain in which I'm operating. Whether you call it a transgression or a violation or just an incident is probably less important to me. As the fact that that willingness to be vulnerable is lowered as a result of that incident. And in some cases, elements like something happening due to lack of trust may be less important. So researchers, trust researchers, explore how in different kinds of contexts, the relative weighting of inferences of competence, integrity, benevolence, consistency, all those, there are many dimensions that inform trust, and depending on the context, there may be different relative weightings. So in some cases, whether someone can chop a tree effectively or not may not matter. In this case, I don't think anyone would care. Any of us could chop a tree effectively, but if we're out in the woods, maybe it would matter.
But how would an apology be relevant if I'm lacking in competence?
The idea there is that when you're apologizing, you're also signaling that it's not going to happen again, and through that, you don't want it to happen again, and through that, you're also signaling that you're going to find some way to correct that. So you might take some lessons in tree chopping, for example, get some instruction, find a better axe or something, be more careful next time. So to the extent that you can signal that your behavior next time will be different because you are remorseful, then that's positive signals. So that's essentially the idea that we're trying to convey. But we've never measured the, I don't think we've measured the extent directly, how much repentance are you signaling, how much guilt are you signaling via these responses, but rather just saying, observing that how much, well, just inferring that how much you signal via these responses will be based in part on the type of violation as well, right? So if someone commits a breach of integrity and someone says they're sorry, well, that person may indeed be sorry, or that person may just be saying sorry in order to set you up for a future transgression. Right? And I think that's why that's a case in which positive information about integrity, it's why it's not weighed as heavily as when it concerns a matter of competence. We somehow inherently believe that people who make mistakes will be able to correct them in the future, at least in these initial sorts of interactions. Maybe after 10 of them, 10 of these screw-ups, we may be less forgiving. But in this one case, with one exposure, we're willing. Yes?
Of all your experimental results, which one would you consider the most counterintuitive, and what's your takeaway from that counterintuitive result?
Well, I think in a way, the nature of the work has been to always present two very solid camps, very solid views that are completely opposing the other, and to reconcile them. So for those that advocate an apology being the best policy, the idea that a denial can be so detrimental, an apology can be so detrimental for an integrity-based violation should be counterintuitive to them. For those political science researchers who advocate denial as the best strategy after an accusation.
But for you as a researcher?
I think for me, the most interesting thing is the idea that these the framing of these transgressions matters so much, and yet in public discourse, it is such an implicit element of our conversation that all, politicians, business leaders, the focus is on whether that person's going to apologize, right? And all the newspapers will talk about this. Is Toyota going to apologize for this brake issue or not, right? How did they apologize? But the conversation is never about, well, it's far less about, was it an act of integrity or competence? When Tiger Woods apologized Friday, the fact that he didn't offer a narrative that would have been helpful is really, it tells me a lot about how little we pay attention to that issue. And for him not to have done that, when it's so clearly a matter of integrity that, as it stands, well, it makes me wonder.
Well, he did confess to losing his moral compass as a result of his fame, right?
Yeah, which is an interesting way in which people nibble at the edges of reframing transgressions. So when you say it's a lapse of judgment, really it's an integrity-based violation, but you're framing it as a competence-based violation because you made a mistake in judgment. And so there's some of that I notice here and there in these conversations. So I think that's perhaps the biggest issue for me, that we pay so little attention to a struggle that goes on implicitly between target and perceiver that is so important, but we just don't do anything about it in most cases. Yeah. Yes.
Sort of following up on that, I mean, I see people pursuing a strategy, just as Madison Avenue has intuitively discovered, what buttons to push to get people to buy things. Presumably, these brand management consultants have discovered how to advise people to make apologies, and so that if you're a politician caught doing anything morally abysmal now, you go into rehab, right? That is, I wanted to be a moral person, but I have a disease, right? That is, that there's a limit to my competence. But then, of course, the problem becomes, what is integrity then? Okay, that is, if not saying no to the bottle or the needle or whatever it is that is being blamed for your lapse of integrity is a violation of competence and not a violation of integrity. And there isn't really any integrity, right? Ultimately, it's all competence. So why does it work, right? I mean, why is there any meaningful distinction between integrity and competence if people can so easily reframe, not reframe, they can't easily reframe, that's the problem. At least President Clinton. If they can so easily reframe their integrity violations as competence violations. And I would point out, just in closing, that this is not, of course, a new strategy, right? So that, I mean, the history of Christianity is based on the idea that you have to struggle, right? That virtue is only achieved by turning your back on sin. So there's always the temptation, and therefore you're weak and you fail and so on. That is, the tension between integrity and competence is there in Christian theology from the beginning.
Which is a really great insight, the idea that the baseline is that we are all as individuals fighting against this irresistible force to be evil, right? That we are tainted by original sin, right? And so that when we commit a sin, it's because we have failed, right? We were unable, there's a lack of confidence, right? Which is, I think, and Clark and I were actually talking about it this morning, this idea that a lot of Christian religions is, in a way, a lot of what their statements are a way of overcoming this weird bias that we have, that as soon as something's framed as an integrity-related issue, we just want to get rid of them. We want nothing to do with them, and yet the preachings of these, Christianity are that we are all susceptible, and that we should forgive those who are committed. Redemption, right? And that integrity, even a mortal sin is something that should be forgiven. You might be given a few more lashes, but eventually you should be as forgiven for those as any other type of transgression. And maybe that's in response to this tendency that seems so irrational in us now, that simple attribution can lead to such devastating effects. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry.
I was wondering, you mentioned that you've tested different kinds of violations. Did those violations differ in intensity? Like, so you wonder if basically if the violation gets to be so harsh, if essentially the difference between competence and integrity will go away, right? At some point, I don't care if you did it on purpose or you did it by accident, this was really bad, right? Does that happen? Have you looked at those kinds of questions?
We haven't yet. We've started talking about it a bit. So far, we've just tried to control the severity of these incidents. Well, basically use the same severity and just frame it as one way or the other, just to get clarity in an experimental sense. But we are curious about the extent to which, there's some research in psychophysics that talks about how our perception of an event may not track well with the absolute nature of that transgression, right? And so one thing we're curious about is whether the way in which that perception is affected by multiple transgressions or more severe transgressions might differ for competence or integrity related issues. So far what we find is that competence, when you frame it as a matter of integrity, it's not necessarily, I think some people have an intuitive belief that simply framing it as an integrity related issue will lead to more damaging consequences, even if the absolute value of the transgression is the same. We don't always find that. Well, we often, in our first study that really looked at the nature of the reactions after an allegation, we don't find that it's necessarily worse, but that's just one exposure, right? So multiple exposures or a harsher incident may lead to some of those reactions. So, and I think it's possible.
And then as far as repeated violations, which is what you were mentioning some of your intuitions about, do you have any ideas about the number of times someone would have to mess up before I essentially, like, is there a number like 3 or something like that, that all of a sudden I'm no longer thinking that this is an exception to a general pattern, right? I'm thinking, oh, this is chronic behavior.
Right, that's a good question. I think a lot of it actually is affected by additional factors. There's research that shows that when we are much more tolerant of transgressions when they're committed by those that we know well, that are close ties with us, we have a stronger pro-relationship motivation. So in that case, we may need 10, right? And even then, we might find ways to mitigate the downsides of those limitations. If we're in a marriage, for example, we work through those failings.
I mean, I also have more information about those people as well, right? So there's a proportion issue.
There's a proportion issue. There's a willingness to make a competence or integrity-based attribution as well. So yeah, I think there are lots of things that play there, but it would be interesting to see if there's a magic number 7, for example, in terms of those kinds of transgressions. Yes?
Excuse me. When I think of competence and integrity, I think in terms of, say, prior expectations of behaviors, and with competence, I'm willing to allow for the fact there'd be quite a bit of variation around the actual performance. I still admit that the person can still be competent. Whereas integrity with a high sense of, integrity always has to be displayed in every instance. Which suggests that it maybe is not so much integrity, competence that's at issue here, but rather those prior expectations. So I was trying to think of a situation in which one would have expectation on a competence side that the competence has associated with it, they will always do it correctly. And I was thinking, for example, something like a sharpshooter, sniper, where your expectation is the person will always be effective in their shot, they'll never miss. And in a situation like that, whether or not if the sharpshooter does miss, is it better for that sharpshooter, as it were, to be responding in the competence sense, that is, apologizing, or in the integrity sense of denying that any basis for that? That is it the violation of the prior expectation that's at issue here, and not so much competence versus integrity?
Yeah, I think prior expectations should play into this, and so the idea of having built some social capital with regard to your ability to perform well in general may lead others to give you more the benefit of the doubt if something bad happens. I think in one of my earlier conversations this morning, we talked about the Republican sort of attempts to grab hold of moral authority, and whether or not that leads to them suffering more as a result of them being caught in affairs, or less so. But you might imagine that there might be some effect of those prior expectations, prior behaviors. But I think a part of the inherent reversal that goes on here, they're called hierarchically restrictive schemas. And they're called this because people believe that if you are incompetent, you'll never perform well. I mean, sometimes maybe due to luck or something like that. So only competent people can perform well. So if you can achieve that level, then that's considered diagnostic. And if you perform poorly, there's all sorts of variation to explain poor performance. For matters of integrity, the noise is on the other side. So even unethical people can behave ethically, because sometimes someone's watching you, so you don't want to steal them, right? And so you might be an angel in some moments, even though you want to commit the crime. But if you're unethical, we believe that there's no variance there. Only unethical people will behave unethically. And so that leads to that one incident being so diagnostic in our mind. So I think that variation element is informing that reaction.
That's another way of looking at cognitive dissonance.
Mm-hmm.
And the expectation that someone will betray a trust or confidence. And when that trust is betrayed, then it sets up a cognitive dissonance situation.
Right. And so, and you might, as a result, and this gets to the idea of prior history. So if you've trusted that person a lot in the past, they commit this breach, you don't want that cognitive dissonance as a result, and so you may be more likely to forgive them if they've had that history simply for that reason. Yeah, Dan.
So that, the model that you just sketched makes sense, but in a world, if that was the model in everyone's head, no one would believe in luck, right? That is, if the only way you can perform well is because you're confident, that there are many ways you can perform poorly, and therefore positive performance is diagnostic of competence, then there would be no luck, right? That is, there would be no positive performance due to circumstances outside of one's control, and yet the concept of luck seems quite pervasive.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it does suggest that there may be some contextual domains in which that hierarchically restrictive schema is going to be less salient. So if you are, for example, a day trader and make $1 million, well, you might think there's some element of luck in that process. You were there at a good time, you made one good bet. But if, in other contexts, I remember when I was younger watching, I don't watch much soccer, professional soccer, but I watched this World Cup game where Diego Maradona took a ball all the way across the field on his own and scored a goal. And that's the only name I know in professional soccer. And I only watched that game for 10 minutes, and it's been ingrained in my mind that he's one of the best soccer players ever. Even though I don't know anything about soccer, I believe that luck had nothing to do with it. There's no way in which luck would allow him to achieve that kind of goal. So that maybe luck on the margin, and maybe this gets to the enormity of the performance, right? So if you have a much stronger signal of redemption, then maybe you're less likely to discount it than if it's a weaker signal and you think luck may play a role, and then suddenly doing better next time. So yeah, I think that contextual factor would play a role in that as well. And also in terms of the strength of the signal that you provide. It's what led us to start exploring the role of substantive responses, for example, to move beyond cheap talk and to get into offering penance, substantive penance for your transgression, or allowing for some regulatory system to be put in place. So you offer an even stronger signal that you're going to fix this in the future. It's not going to happen again. In that study, we find that it's still, the effectiveness of those responses still depended on that attribution, so that those dynamics were still playing out. But one might imagine that if you were to take it even further, right, then in that study, they took a substantial pay cut, but, you know, that in the grand scheme of things may not be seen as that significant. Someone who gives away all their money to charity and becomes a monk, you know, that kind of behavior, maybe that will allow us to place more faith in those positive signals as being something that has less to do with noise or some other inducement. Yes?
A lot of the discussion has to do sort of with control, how much control that you have over the situation versus how much did circumstances determine it. And I saw at the beginning of the papers of yours, you didn't want cultural differences. And I know there's some literature on sort of fundamental attribution error and stuff, east-west differences. Does it play out any differently?
Yes. We find that in general the overall interaction holds, but that there's an important difference in terms of how the Japanese would make inferences from apologies relative to the US because of this different inference about locus of causality. In the US, we believe that we control our fates, and in many East Asian cultures they do not. That leads to the idea that when you're apologizing, in the US, it's offering a stronger signal that, yes, I caused this incident and that I'm going to fix it, right? So both elements of that causality are there. In Japan, the idea is that, well, we may apologize, but it's not necessarily, we don't infer that it means that you individually caused this, because we don't believe that individuals cause anything that have as much control, and we also don't believe that you have as much control over fixing it. And so, because of that different inference of blame and redemption in the Japanese setting, what you should expect is that for an integrity-based violation, an apology will be less detrimental, because it's signaling, it's offering a weaker, it's not offering as strong a signal that I caused this incident. It's treated more as this expression of general remorse. So when you apologize for an integrity-based violation, it should be more harmful in the U.S. than in Japan. But for a competence-based violation, it should be reversed, because the causality isn't there either. When you apologize for a competence-based violation, it should be more effective in the U.S. because you're saying, yes, I'm going to fix this in the future. Whereas in Japan, if you don't believe that people have such control over their fates, well, that's going to offer less of a diagnostic signal for you. And we get that reversal in terms of our data.
And yet Japan has been much more reluctant to apologize for its World War II aggression than Germany.
Yeah, that's an interesting case. But in general, what you see for CEOs, for example, is that you have these people apologizing in ways that you never see in the U.S. So there was an incident in which there's this blood scandal. The health ministry used tainted blood and knew about this for a long time, and led to a number of deaths and so on. The health minister apologized for that incident, despite the fact that he joined the organization after that incident occurred, right? And you have more examples of this happening. I think in the US, there's more of an acceptance of the use of apology lately. You see more CEOs apologizing, but even, when you look at Enron, for example, Ken Lay and Skilling, they denied culpability even after being found guilty. They denied culpability to the very end. And in Japan, you see these apologies happening more often. Part of it may have to do with the legal system. And so one conversation that's going on in hospitals is that doctors they're finding that when doctors apologize for medical mistakes, the people are far less likely to sue than if they don't. And yet, doctors are really reluctant to do that. And so there are actually training programs now to help doctors apologize, to encourage them to do that, recognizing that this is a benefit. And there's some legal modifications that are going on that are trying to allow apologies to be expressed without that necessarily signaling guilt on behalf of the doctor. Excuse me. Yes.
You mentioned the interest in cross-cultural or cross-national differences. So what if you did this study in rural Kenya or a favela slum in Brazil and many, many other places around the world? Two thoughts come to mind. First of all, we're a Brahmin family in India. the social identity of the person whom you're characterizing as the individual compared to the group, I would question that. I think the difference you're emphasizing there is widely varying around the world. An individual thinks of a cultural model of himself as embedded in a social identity of a group already, different perhaps than your undergraduates and graduate students who are responding to your vignettes.
It's possible. So, so one possibility is that maybe even in Kenya or these other sites, when they're responding individually, they feel like they're responding on behalf of their group, and maybe so those differences might be diminished. Yeah, I think that'd be interesting to explore the extent to which you feel like your own responses are just affecting yourself versus those around you, or other ideas like that, playing around with this idea of individuality versus groupness. Yes?
With respect to your finding, you described across your studies, the trust towards an apologetic target was lower in group situations than individuals. So I was wondering if you could flesh out your reasoning actually about why that should be the case, why it was the case, and if you have got any sort of causal, some data actually speaks to the causal mechanism, but actually why that would be more of the case in a group situation as opposed to individual.
Sure. Yeah, and so the theoretical basis for the idea was simply that after transgression, there's essentially a conflict that occurs in terms of these identities that each side wants to have for the culprit. So those that are accused of having committed the transgression will want to say that they are actually trustworthy. In general, that's the case. Even if you're guilty, you want others to believe that you are going to be trustworthy in the future. Whereas the inherent nature of a transgression or a trust violation is that those who are perceiving that person are going to see that person as less trustworthy. So there are these initial stances that occur after transgression, and then the idea is that when you have more people on the side of the perceiver, that's going to magnify the effect. There are a variety of potential mechanisms. One of the mechanisms that we explored was this expression of persuasive arguments, supportive or unsupportive arguments. And we find that is what's mediating the effect, that when groups are harsher than individuals, it's the result of individuals in that group saying, I don't think that person should be trusted for X reason, and another person says Y reason or whatever, and those inform the sentiments of the others, and so it builds into a collective sentiment, all sort of magnifying this initial disposition to distrust that individual that makes them trustworthy.
Do you think that might be a model for why it might be the case that groups might be more punitive in general, right? So you got this explanation for why societies or groups exist by economists that will say that it's really just groups exist to manage risk, right?
Mhm.
And being negative towards somebody, right? Saying this person is bad or something like that can have repercussions. That can have individual. It's easier for us to say this in a group than in individual. I'm wondering to what extent you might even take the mediation another step to see to what extent this sort of punitive sentiment issues actually might in fact even be driving trust down further.
Oh, interesting. So it's possible that you might want to be punitive as an individual towards someone, but you worry
That's right.
about
That's
backlash.
exactly.
But if you're in a collective setting, you're less worried about that backlash. We didn't measure that. And in this particular case, they're making evaluations without, they were anonymous. But in a case where they could be identified, that could be an additional factor, definitely. Yeah, we've really just scratched the surface with these kinds of questions, and I think there are lots of really interesting areas to pursue further. Yes?
I'm just wondering if any work has been done sort of looking at the flip side of this about merit versus windfall or something versus, instead of it all being sort of negative transgressions, but how you would see
Yeah,
the opposite effect.
The hierarchically restrictive schemas really play out on both sides, and so it would certainly be the case that your reputation for competence could depends on this as well. And so, for example, as an aspiring scholar, there may be multiple journals in your field, and I don't know about your fields, but in mine, there's a variety of journals, and with the nature of academics, we often discount the journals that we don't publish in, and other people do the same, right? And so it's unclear which journals are the ones to publish in and which ones aren't. There's some convergence, but a lot of noise. Well, what can you do in the face of that to avoid any criticism that you are just one kind of researcher and limited in some way? Well, it suggests the hierarchically restrictive schema suggests that you should publish one paper in each journal. Doing it once should convince observers that you're capable of publishing in that journal, and if you were not capable, you wouldn't have been able to do it once. Maybe there's an attribution of luck there, but if you did it twice, then two should be sufficient, right? And so, to the extent that reputations can be formed, I think they are informed through these schemas as well, so that fewer instances of competence are needed to show. And it's uplifting if you are a graduate student, for example, who's made a mistake at one point. You may think that your career is over, but it's not, because what it says is that once you do a good job, once you may have screwed up a study entirely, but if your next study gets into the top journal in your field, they'll see that you are a very competent person. Right? So those schemas can be very beneficial in that sense.
We probably ought to cut off discussion at this point because we're a little bit over our time.
Okay.
Thank you very much.